Our keynote speaker is Bill Franks. Bill is the Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute for Analytics, or IIA, where he provides perspective on trends in the analytics, big data space, and helps clients understand how IIA can support their efforts to improve analytics performance. Franks is also the author of the books Taming the Big Data Tidal Wave and The Analytics Revolution. He is a sought-after speaker and frequent blogger who has been ranked a top 10 global big data influencer, a top global artificial intelligence and big data influencer, and was an inaugural inductee into the Analytics Hall of Fame. His work, including several years as Chief Analytics Officer for Teradata, New York Stock Exchange TDC, has spanned clients in a variety of industries for companies ranging in size from Fortune 100 companies to small nonprofit organizations. You can learn more at bill-franks.com. Bill Franks.
Thank you. All right, Zelio, I was thinking about Amelia's thing about a date a scientist event. It sounds like if you're ever somewhere and you're hungry and they have a buffet table and punch bowl set out and you want it to yourself, just make a quick sign that says this is the food for the data scientist event. You'll have it all to yourself. Although I suspect if you were to ask your friends, you have Friday morning, you have to fight traffic downtown, you can either A, go to a date a scientist event, or B, listen to some dude talk about ethics. I'm not sure how people would rate that. So I promise you, I hope this will be interesting and informative. And my goal is actually to challenge your all's thinking about how you approach analytics, particularly as it relates to ethics, because I don't think that there's enough focus put on it. So first of all, as you'll see, I think they're adjusting the mic. All right. Okay. As you'll see, it's not just about scores. People tend to think about the concern around ethics is just, oh, you're scoring something you shouldn't, like a Chinese social credit score or trying to identify people in a stadium, et cetera. But it's much, much more than that, as we'll go through. And it's also very complex. When you think about things like GDPR, one of the most touted features of that law and similar laws is this supposed right to be forgotten. But even that is a little bit sticky, so think about it. I get tired of doing business with a given company. I say, forget about me. So ostensibly, they have to delete all record of me. But then it gets really interesting. What if I own products from that company that have a warranty that's still active? Now, do they need to delete those warranty records? And now that makes me unable to file a claim because they won't be able to identify me as an owner, or would they keep that warranty record? What about medical records? Can I go to the hospital and say, I want you to delete all those records about that illness because I don't want it to infect my insurance? So there are some exceptions built into the law, but the point is that it can get very tricky, and every rule also tends to have exceptions, and that's where you have to be careful and think it through. So if you look at the standard little analytic flow chart, what I'm hoping to impart on you today is that you need to think about ethics at every single point in the process, and I'm going to take each of these one by one. So let's start with the model target / business problem. So what are you going to model in the first place? And this is the first spot that it's going to get a little bit tricky on you. So true story, a number of years back, I was working with two very large retailers in the grocery mass merchandise space. They both also had gas pumps at some of their locations. And so this was back when it was first possible to put those personalized coupons on receipt tapes that now you get 5 feet of receipt tape at some places. And you could do it at the gas pump as well. Now the interesting thing was both of these retailers did not have a loyalty program, and that was intentional. And I remember talking to them, and we were discussing the fact that while they don't have a loyalty program, they see the same credit card again and again, and you know that the same credit card is effectively the same person. You can do all of the customer level analytics that you could do with a loyalty card on that credit card based data. Now you couldn't legally then match it back, so they wouldn't be able to match it back to me and say, that's Bill Franks. But what they could do is on the receipt tape make an offer based on my history, and instead of saying, welcome back, Bill, here's an offer, it just says, welcome back, here's an offer. I mean, the pragmatic difference is very, very trivial. And so what was real interesting here was both companies went away, they talked about it, they ran it past their lawyers and their executive team. One of them came back and said, we absolutely love this. We think this will add values to our customer. We want to pursue this. This makes a lot of sense. You know, our lawyers have signed off. It's definitely legal. We're not matching anything back, and we're going to be transparent about it. The other company came back and said, okay, we talked about it. The lawyer said it was legal, but, you know, we think part of why we don't have a loyalty program and our value prop to our customers is that we aren't analyzing and tracking them. And even though we don't know who they are, we think this kind of skates up to that line, and so we're not comfortable doing it. We're not going to proceed. So you had two companies, same point in time, exact same situation and decision, and they made two opposite decisions. And the point here, you may agree with one more than the other, but what I liked about both is that they went through the right process. They talked about it, they thought about it from multiple angles, and they made the decision that was best for them and their specific ethical guidelines. Another legendary story in the world of analytics is the Target scenario from, how many people have heard about the whole Target predicting pregnancy? Surprisingly, maybe barely half. So the real quick rundown on this is they had a loyalty program predicting hundreds of things, and it's probably 6-7 years ago now. New York Times did an expose on how horrible Target was because you know, they're predicting pregnancy, and there was a true story. There was a 17-year-old girl who started getting pregnancy mailings. Her dad got rather upset, went in and raised hell at the Target store, and ends up that she actually was pregnant, and Target knew it before the dad. So big black eye, right? Ironically, the guy that did this work, I knew him. We were doing some work at the same time with him. He's the nicest guy ever. And I remember him mentioning an offhand at a conversation we were having about how he had a really good discussion at a conference with a reporter at a lunch table. I was like, dude, what did you talk to the reporter about? They're really not your friend, probably. He goes, oh, it was nothing. We were just talking about our modeling initiatives. Well, that's who the reporter was the New York Times reporter. So anyway, here's the point. Let's break this down. Is what Target did there legal? 100% absolutely. They had a loyalty program. It was well documented. People signed up. They said, we're going to analyze your data and predict all kinds of things about you. Was it ethical? I'd say for the most part, yes, because here's the deal. They were predicting hundreds of things about you. There wasn't a person going through and looking at who's pregnant, who's not. They were predicting, do you do sports? Will you buy fashion? Do you like healthy foods? Are you pregnant? Was one of many health conditions they were predicting as well. They were just thinking of interesting things they could predict from the data. So from a science and mathematical perspective, there wasn't that much different there. But the part that they failed is number 3 up there. Even if everyone could agree that it was ethical and legal, and maybe not everyone would agree it was ethical, but even if you did, customers didn't find that acceptable. People found it not a good thing. So you have to look at all 3 of these levels, and they should ideally all be the same. But actually, legal is the lowest bar today because the laws haven't caught up. There's all sorts of things that are legal that I think we'd all agree are clearly unethical, and we read about those in the paper. But the strictest is what customers will accept, or the population as a whole will accept. So you have to think that through. So let's go to the model input data. This would be the second area that you have to hit. So here's one of the things that's really intriguing. When you think about all types of predictive analytics and even AI routines, almost all of them rely on using past data to identify patterns. And so part of the issue becomes whatever the past patterns were, you will be able to model and then effectively cause them to be replicated, which is great if that makes sense. But imagine this, if you're building a college admissions model using the last 10, 20, 30 years of data, you will be able to accurately predict then of these applicants which are most likely to complete a degree in 4 years successfully, and you can admit the people that best fit the profile of those who have done that in the last 10 or 20 years. And that's great if the criteria of what will make someone succeed today at a college is actually identical to what it was 5 years and 10 years and 15 years ago. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? That's not the point of me bringing this up. The point is that's a question you have to ask and you have to make sure of. Another great example of this is you can read about some of these things they're using in law enforcement where they have models now to help judges do sentences because there's a lot of discretion judges have in giving sentences. And the same crime, 2 different people could do vastly different amounts of prison time and or community service, et cetera. So they'll run models and say, historically speaking, a defendant with this general criminal history charged with these general things would have had, let's say, an average 6-month sentence and 6 months probation. And so the judge at least knows this is where it typically netted out. Now, again, that's great, but what if, as a society, we've decided that certain offenses should be treated more harshly or more leniently than they have in the past? And again, we can read about this in the news all the time, where we're saying we want to make some things less punished and other things more punished. Those models then break down. It's not really ethical to use a model based on when we treated something harshly to then sentence someone today when we've all agreed that we should treat them less harshly. At least not without a pretty heavy disclaimer to the judge, by the way, this is based on history, and today we're trying to go for about 50% of the historical norm. So you have to think about that. You also have to think about who owns data and what your data you're allowed to use. A huge liability area I've seen a lot of companies do is someone goes and acquires some third-party data for a given project and puts it out on the network. And then someone else, or puts it out on a data lake or data warehouse. And someone else goes, oh, I didn't know we had this data. Awesome, I'm going to pull that in. It's going to help me in my model. Well, other than ethically, you didn't ask or have permission. Legally, probably you could get your company sued pretty bad because there was an agreement as to how the data could be used. But it gets even dicier. Let's take IoT and sensors in an aircraft engine. Who should legally have the ability to acquire and analyze data from a sensor in an aircraft engine? Well, for starters, let's say you make the engines, like Rolls-Royce. Clearly, Rolls-Royce could probably make a pretty strong claim. We make the engine, we've got to track it for safety issues, for product improvement. Obviously, we need to acquire and analyze that data. Okay, fair enough. You could be Boeing who's making an airplane. Boeing, they'll say, well, I'm putting that thing on my plane. I need to monitor the engine and everything else about the plane because we're on the hook for product quality, safety, et cetera. Fair enough. You could have Delta Airlines saying, well, we own the plane. Of course, we need to monitor all this for all of the same exact reasons. You could have the FAA saying, well, we're the government agency tasked with monitoring all of the planes everywhere and being up on safety. We should capture and analyze that data. So just there, I'll stop. That's 4 different constituencies, completely different, that all could probably make a plausible claim that they should have that data. But even if they should, do they have the right and ability to use it in the same way? So the FAA clearly should be able to compare things across airlines to look for safety issues. Boeing ostensibly might be able to do the same thing, but is that really fair for Boeing? Is it Boeing's role to start to analyze airlines and then sell to one airline or another information they could use to market against their competition? You know, I think that gets dicier. So you have to address both who can actually exactly how. And in the aircraft engine, I would argue if we really spent a half hour together, we could come up with probably all 4 of those groups could analyze it, but they'd all have bounds on to what was fair or foul for each of those specific constituencies. And the most critical thing here is you've got to have it in your contract. This isn't something that's going to be a default. You have to specify this and take the time. So let's say you've got a model target that everybody agrees is totally good. You know your data is okay. Now you got to have some transparency and monitoring of those models. So what does that look like? AI is inherently opaque. We know that. The beauty of this is work's being done to help overcome that. So, you know, if you're building credit models today, you're not allowed legally to use AI, for example, because you have to be able to document for the government exactly what went into those models and exactly what weight they had. In fact, if you go to a credit agency site, they actually will tell you 15% of your score is based on factors related to on-time payments, 10%, et cetera. But here's what's really cool. There's a process called LIME, Local Interpretable Model Agnostic Explanations. It's a mouthful. What it does, let's say I have an AI routine that will identify tree frogs in a picture. And this would be, say, millions and millions of iterations to get to that model. This does a really interesting thing. On the back end, it's going to take the same pictures that were input, or some tree frog pictures, and randomly blank out portions of that image again and again and again, and find out what's the probability that this image is now a tree frog. You do that millions and millions and millions of times. You take averaging of that, and you can then identify which part of the image is actually driving most the prediction that that's a tree frog. So over time, it very well could be that we come up with guidelines that if you use a certain type of line with a certain minimum number of repetitions and a certain level of average explanation coming out, that would count as transparency. Now the interesting thing, if you notice, it said model agnostic is part of it. So while this has been coming to the forefront with AI, it has nothing to do with AI. This would work with any model. So if I was an insurance website and I did not put some procedures to stop bots, and I had a classic decision tree or logistic regression to approve a policy, I could build a little bot to go and hit that site again and again and randomly change my income, my age, my home value, et cetera. And after many, many iterations, much like here, I could then reverse engineer exactly what their scoring model was. So this is a really cool technology. It's one where I think it gets associated with AI, but it actually theoretically has nothing to do with AI. And then you get into the monitoring. And this is something I don't think it's taken seriously enough, particularly as we embed and automate models into operational systems that are making decisions on an ongoing basis. So this is a chart from the flash crash in 2010. Let's see where we are. If you notice down at the bottom right, minimum price of 1 penny, maximum price of 42 bucks almost, and it's currently 33. That's not a typical chart. This was for Accenture. I always make the point that Accenture had nothing to do with this. It had nothing to do with the companies that were impacted. This is just the chart that I was able to find. And this blow up is of this little part here where there's a dark line. What happened was automated trading algorithms went haywire, fed off each other, and drove a number of stocks down to virtually zero in a matter of seconds to minutes. And then, of course, it rebounded pretty quickly. And this caused mayhem. So they actually had to do a whole lot of fixing of this. So the stock market deemed it not a fair trading environment, and they reversed the trades during that period. So if you had a limit order, and if you know what a limit order is, if the stock's around 40, you could say if it goes below 38, sell. And even in a really bad scenario, you might sell 37, maybe 36 in a panic, but you're not going to be selling at a penny. So they reversed it. But now if you were lucky enough to be sitting at lunch and saw Accenture at a penny and bought a couple 100,000 shares for a few $1,000s and you were a millionaire 2 minutes later, you were equally upset now because they just took away your money. Right? So luckily I wasn't one of those. That'd be a story for the ages, how you made $1 million in 2 minutes and lost it because, quote, the government took it away, but let's face it, it really wasn't fair. So here's the deal, though. People at the time, this would put the automated trading out of business. It didn't, right? Big issue. Two things should have been done better. They should have had better self-check within that algorithm to turn itself off if things. They needed to have somebody also monitoring it, ready to hit the stop button if they saw something happening. And so today, my guess is all of these algorithms have better inherent built-in self-checking and also people watching better so that this doesn't happen again. And this is a parallel to in a manufacturing plant. I was really lucky last week. I got to get a detailed tour of a Ford manufacturing facility, watching everything from the first 4 beams of the frame up to the finished car. And all throughout, they have a pull chain or a button you can press if you see any safety issue. Anybody in the whole plant will bring everything to a halt until it's addressed. That's what you have to do ethically here is you've got to have a way to step in and stop problems. So now you're monitoring. What about model usage? This is not as clean as it sounds because you build a model for a given purpose, but is it going to be used properly, and where else can you use it? And one of the trickiest things is around context. So you can take this picture, and I remember seeing a study that took pictures just like this, and they trained a bunch of AI routines to identify things like it's 2 women playing tennis, she's wearing a visor. So here's a good, let's do a quiz, see how you compare to the AI. How many people think that she's just about to hit a tennis ball? Show of hands. Don't be shy. Okay. Very reasonable. How many people think she just hit a tennis ball? Show of hands. Okay, about 50-50. How many people, by hearing both of those questions and seeing the answers, just realize that we have a problem? Okay? So here's the deal. In absence of any other context, if I were to suggest to you she just hit the tennis, if I actually stated, yeah, here's a picture and she just hit the tennis ball, no one would actually question that because it's very, very reasonable. At the same time, if I said, oh, here's a picture right before she hit the tennis ball, with that content, you would 100% believe me. No one would question that. They're both plausible. The key is this. We then realize, wait a minute, either she just hit it or she's just about to hit it. That alone doesn't tell us. If we had 2 consecutive frames, now we'd know for sure because the ball's either closer or further. The problem is you have 2 AI routines. One is identified to train, did she hit the tennis ball? One is train, is she about to hit the tennis ball? Both of them would flag this at 99 point something probability. But they would both be too dumb to realize that they can't both be simultaneous. That's the hardest part to me of AI. It's not even getting the models to do what we want them to do. It's putting the wrappers around them that make them know when they don't know enough. And I liken this to when I used to be hands-on coding all day. I used to always say, I can get code to do exactly what I want when everything's the way it should be in about 10% of the time. My other 90% of the time is idiot-proofing it and handling all the other things that can just go wrong. I think it's the same thing here. While we're having a lot of success with AI, ethically, the hardest part is going to be how do we teach these things to know their limits and to not have a scenario like this where you're saying two things that both are imminently possible but jointly totally impossible. That's very, very, very hard. Here's another one. This is a great one too. We've got to get real about how we measure these things. We have to get society in line as well. We make trade-offs all the time in terms of risk and reward. So let me give you a true story here. I had a friend when I was growing up in high school who was driving at night and someone ran either a red light or a stop sign at high speed and smacked her right in the driver's side door very fast. Now, here's the interesting thing. My friend was not wearing a seatbelt. What she did, she jumped over to the, I think I started about 10 after, right? We were about 10 minutes behind. Right, oh, 10, okay, yeah, right, we're good. Yeah. And so she threw herself towards the passenger side, and I got a few scratches, it wasn't too bad. The police officer told her, had you had on your seatbelt, you'd be dead. Okay? So here's the deal. I can identify a friend of mine that was saved because she didn't wear a seatbelt. Now, I can guarantee you I can go out in this past 12-month period and probably find thousands of people who were saved because they were not wearing a seatbelt. And I can get them all to come and stand on Capitol Hill and talk about their experience of how they were saved because they didn't wear an evil seatbelt and start a whole movement to ban seatbelts because they cost lives, and I can prove it here. Thousands of people whose lives were saved by shunning the evil seatbelt. But you would say, well, that's kind of silly, Bill. Come on. Well, why is it silly? Well, because statistically, seatbelts save lives. We can go find, for every 1,000 you find, we'll find 10,000 or 100,000 who were saved because of the seatbelt. And we accept that. But this isn't how it works with AI and analytics, is it? As soon as one autonomous vehicle has one crash, it makes international news, and everyone talks about banning autonomous vehicles and that they're unsafe. What we have to get to when you talk about the usage of the models is people have to accept that we need to measure on an objective criteria. If for every 100,000 miles driven by an autonomous vehicle, they have X deaths or injuries, and that compares to multiples of X for people, then it's a rational and logical and safe thing, just like with seatbelts, to say we're going to let the autonomous vehicles go out there. Now, what is bad is it's really unfortunate if it's you or a family member of yours who gets killed because of the seatbelt or gets killed because it's a scenario where the autonomous vehicle caused a crash that we think people likely wouldn't. But we handle the statistics. So to me, this is one of the diciest parts as AI and analytics become a bigger and bigger factor in our life is how to handle that. So let's finish with one last thing. All of this leads to needing to define policies. And the problem today, back to the legalities, is that it's not really clear at all. And it can be vague. So I saw a CEO of a hospital conglomerate. Imagine here how we have, Wellstar or other big hospital chains. Same concept from the Midwest. And he said that they were terrified of having this DNA data in their database now when they're starting to collect DNA data as part of a treatment. He said, first, if we get hacked, we're host, right? Imagine the liability on someone's DNA being stolen. But then he pointed out how they were worried about the other factor. Let's say in a few years they come up with a test that if they went through your DNA, they could tell you with a pretty good certainty that you're going to die of some really bad disease by a defined point in time. He said, so if we go out and alert people that we have this test, now someone comes in and takes that test, find out they're going to die, they go off the rails, they start doing drugs, blow through their savings, and their family comes and sues us later and says, they were perfectly happy, and you alerted them to this test we didn't ask you to alert us to, and now you've ruined their life, and we want $1 million. He goes, but let's say we don't alert everybody to it, and someone has this and doesn't know it and dies, but dies without having had a will, without taking care of things. He goes, now their family might come and go, you know what? You had the ability to alert us to this test, where that person could have known this was coming and could have taken care of all of this that's caused our family pain. We're going to sue you for $1 million. And he said, the worst part is I believe we would lose both of those lawsuits today, potentially. If we tell people we'll get sued and lose, if we don't tell people we'll get sued and lose. So their solution, For now, as soon as they're done with a treatment path that needs a DNA, they're going to delete it, so they don't have it at all. And now you wince and you go, oh gosh, well that's kind of negative. But this gets to the point of, from a pure liability perspective, it's hard to argue with what he said. And that's back to, we have to have the policies that work. And the most important thing is taking a stand. And so again, not judging this decision, but pointing it out. A few years ago, Apple, and this wasn't directly analytics, but it proves the point very well. Apple was asked to unlock a cell phone, an iPhone of a terrorist who had done a bombing, and it was only, quote, just this one iPhone, just this one time. Of course, Apple said, well, first of all, of course, we all know as soon as we unlock this one time, we'll get a subpoena to do it again and again. Someone will eventually reverse engineer or leak this, and every iPhone will be insecure. And they said, look, our whole value prop has always been, we're secure, we value privacy, we're not going to do it. So here's the deal. There's probably people who abandoned Apple over this because they were offended by that decision. There's probably people who came to Apple because of that decision. My point isn't to judge right or wrong. You can do that on your own. The point is, wouldn't you rather know where they stood? Isn't it better that we all know exactly where Apple stands and why, and then we can make an informed decision? There's no ambiguity about that. And if they ever got in a lawsuit over this thing, they'll be able to show a history of, we had this policy, we stuck by the policy, we've been consistent about this policy. Far better than you're getting hauled into court. Well, you never really had a policy on this, did you? Yeah, I guess we didn't. And we find an example over here where this data scientist did this and this other data scientist did the other thing, right? Yeah. And you didn't actually stop either one of them from doing these different decisions. Yeah, I guess that's true. And worse, you're letting this 25-year-old new master's degree student make a decision like this without any training, any context. I think you're in a lot bigger trouble. So you've got to start to do that. So to finish up then, these are the 5 points, at least minimum, that you need to be thinking about ethics, and it permeates it. So what do you do from here? The first thing is, until the laws and public opinion catch up, you've got to be extra double cautious. You have to be intentional about bringing this up, talking about it, writing down these rules. And by intentional, you can do a number of things. Set up an ethics review board. This borrows from research in universities and public research funding, where if you're going to touch a human or an animal, physically or emotionally, you have to go through an independent board that looks at everything you're doing and why you explain that it's okay and ethical, and you cannot proceed till you have that approval. You don't have to do something that formal, but imagine having in your organization, the legal team, the sales team, the marketing team, the data science team, everybody in there having a discussion, in particular when there's a new data source to be used, or a new way to use an existing data source, or a new place that you're going to apply a score, to make sure you're having that discussion. Make sure that you write down a policy as well. It's not enough to talk about it. And you have to force people to document. I'm a big fan of, in a project plan, you should have a space, ethical considerations. There might be times the ethical consideration says, this is the same thing we've been doing for 10 years, we see no new ethical considerations for this project. Okay, fair enough, but at least you've documented that fact. Versus ethical considerations, yeah, you know what, we don't explicitly have customers' permission to use the data in this way, but our interpretation is that it's fair. We should check that with the legal team and also the review board to make sure that as an organization we're comfortable with that. And then the most important thing is that you guys in the analytics and data science community have to take ownership of this. You can't, the worst thing people go, yeah, well, that's legal's job, or that's the CEO's job, and I'm just going to do what I do until somebody tells me different. That's really, in my mind, pushing things off. And worse yet, putting yourself and or your team at risk, because now you're explicitly failing to address this. And again, the consequences of missing something important could be even worse. So step up and take this responsibility. Force this. Even if you're a new data scientist 1 year into your job, start talking about the ethical issues of your projects and pushing it up the chain, and encourage your boss to, et cetera, and make this a thing. Because it is becoming a thing, and it's going to get more and more and more attention. So just summarizing, make it a priority, set up that review board, get those written policies in place, and then be sure and enforce them very vigorously when someone violates them. Just aim for transparency and fairness. I think it's that easy. Back to that very first example of two companies making the opposite decision. They aimed to be fair and transparent about why they were deciding what they were deciding in context of everything that they had. And then put yourself in the shoes of those on the other side of whatever you're doing. if I owned this data, would I be comfortable with someone using it this way without permission? Or if I was being predicted to be pregnant, would I be comfortable? Now what I'll say, back to the hierarchy of things, if you're comfortable, that's not enough because you might have a much looser criteria than others. You still need to check this with others. But if you are uncomfortable, that should be a big red flag because if you're uncomfortable, chances are other people will be as well. So if anybody's really motivated by this topic, currently we're just starting a book with O'Reilly Media, and we're looking for blogs 500 to 700, maybe as much as 1,000 words on any topic around the ethics of data science. There's a URL there, tinyurl/97dataethics. If you go there, it has the submission guidelines. You retain rights to your blog, just giving us a right to publish in this book that'll have 97 different perspectives. So you can go out there, and I'd love to have a huge Atlanta representation of blogs in that book. And so you're welcome to check that out, and I encourage you to do so. And with that, if you have questions later, that's my contact info. You're welcome to reach out. And I think, do I have time for a question or two, or am I done with the time? No Q&A. Perfect. Thank you.